Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. I'm very honored to have with me on the show today Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller, President and CEO of the Center for Security Policy. Waller retired from the Marine Corps Reserves at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel after serving more than 2 decades on both active duty and in the reserves with deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa, and the Caribbean. Since joining the Marine Corps in 1998, Waller has served as part of a Marine Expeditionary Unit, as a reconnaissance platoon commander, and in multiple roles in Marine Corps Reserve's 4th Marine Division. Waller has been a key staff member of the U.S. Air Force's Electromagnetic Defense Task Force. He joined the Center for Security Policy in 2014 as Director of Infrastructure Security, now holding the roles of President and CEO. Lieutenant Colonel, welcome, and thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Yeah, Kyle, thanks for having me on.
All right, so you have had quite the military career. You have experienced a lot within your time serving our country in the Marines. So first and foremost, thank you so much for your service there. And we just are eager to hear a little bit more about your time serving in the Marines.
Sure. Yeah, well, Kyle, it was really a calling since I was very small. I always wanted to serve. I had both of my grandparents, my grandfathers on both sides of the family served in the military, one in the Marines and the other in the U.S. Air Force. And so it was just, I really think something that God put in my heart as a very young man. And so most of my adolescent teen life was just training and preparing myself for that service. And so I feel very privileged that I had a lot of good mentors that helped me along the way, and that I had the opportunity to achieve a lot of the goals that I had set for serving in the Marines. And you know, I told myself that I would leave the Marine Corps when they didn't want me anymore. That I would serve until I was no longer asked to serve, and that's in fact what happened, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Well, yeah, let's jump right into that. Have so many questions for you about your service and what that looked like, but you also went through something very challenging toward the end of your service. Tell us what happened there.
Sure. Yeah. And I should just say, I mean, you had mentioned in the bio that my work for the Center for Security Policy started about 10 years ago. And so the first half of my military career was on active duty. And honestly, I felt called to leave active duty. It's a great story, probably too long for this podcast, but really a God thing, right? These indicators that God wanted my wife and I to leave active duty, and I didn't know what for. And in fact, I actually kind of bounced around with different occupations until the day I just absolutely, truly gave it up to God. And was just like, Lord, I don't know why you wanted me to leave active duty, but I give up. It's on you now. And literally, 6 hours later, I got a call about a job that I didn't even apply for at the Center for Security Policy, this amazing nonprofit. And so that was an answer to prayer. And at least from that time till now, every indication that I can see is what God wants me to be doing. And so the last half of that military career was in the reserves. And I had this civilian job where I was able to actually analyze what threatens the republic, right? So I think it's important, maybe as we go through the story of the end of my military career, how that happened, and why I was able to be, I guess, informed from a different perspective than many of the people who were in uniform, right? So to bluntly, briefly answer the question of what led to the end of my career, it was the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. And so, I'd be happy to talk about the lead up to that and sort of the dynamics of what sort of decisions needed to be made.
Yeah, tell us what happened, because you were active in the military, you're on active duty, you're there to serve, saying you're going to serve until they don't need you anymore. And here comes COVID. And was it a mandate for every single person in the armed services to receive the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, it was. But let's rewind the clock a little bit, right? So before the vaccine mandate came out, you had a series of, in the course of my work, right? So the Center for Security Policy, our nonprofit, very basic mission statement, right? We provide uncompromised analysis, unflinching leadership, and unconventional solutions to keep Americans safer. And in the course of that work, I saw with my own eyes many things that I knew to be factually true about threats to our republic. And I saw the response be ridicule, censorship, deplatforming of people who spoke those truths. And so the decision that I made ultimately to not take the vaccine or to force my subordinates against their will to take it is something that was informed by a pattern of analysis that I was blessed to have working for this nonprofit for almost a decade. And so what I would encourage the listeners to think about is just even the beginning of COVID, right? You have this virus that comes out from a laboratory or that comes out from a city where the only level 4 biological warfare, facility that the Chinese Communist Party operates is in the same city, right? That's kind of what we might call a clue. And what you saw was this massive effort to censor, ridicule, deplatform anyone who pointed to what looked to be pretty obvious facts or evidence of the origins of the virus, right? And chief among those people who had a certain narrative was a man named Anthony Fauci, right? And so that whole process of COVID coming out and the response, the media, the government, what people had to say about the virus itself, for me was a data point, right? Because I saw the same patterns being applied to other things that I knew that we had spoken truth about in the past that were factually true and that were ridiculed, deplatformed, censored. And so in the course of my work, so Kyle, I was at the time the commander of the Marine Corps Reserve Force Recon Company. It's got a bunch of amazing Marines that I had the opportunity to serve as their CO. And we're doing the best we can to navigate COVID. But when the vaccine piece started to come out, there were some very, very worrisome things that I saw. And a lot of it has to do with those same patterns of censorship, ridicule, deplatforming. But there was also the medical piece, right? You started to see some people really question, wait a minute, we're starting to see indicators that things like myocarditis could happen in young, physically fit males, right? And so I did everything I could. In fact, it was about this time, a couple of years ago, 2021, that I took the entire 4th of July, what would have been a holiday weekend, and dove into that issue of the vaccine, its effectiveness, its the health risks, and especially the legal ramifications of an emergency use authorized drug or vaccine. And what I found was really, really worrisome.
So you're the commanding officer for this unit of reserves. About how many people were underneath you at that time?
So it's a real small unit, a force reconnaissance company. It's kind of tiny in terms of having a lieutenant colonel commander, right? A lot of times lieutenant colonels will command battalions. It'll have, 700-800 people. Ours is only about 150, but it's some of the most highly trained, Marines that there are. The amount of training that goes into making a reconnaissance Marine, and then throughout their career, all of the qualifications they have. I'll give you an example of some of the Marines that we had that were very concerned about this vaccine. These were guys that were, for example, a recon Marine. That's a whole pipeline of schools that cost the American taxpayer a ton of money. A scout sniper, parachutist, free fall parachutist, jump master, free fall jump master, combatant diver supervisor. It takes millions and millions of dollars and years to create that kind of capability in a man. And this ought to be of something, these capabilities should be of great value to the service, right? But what we saw is that if that Marine, in this case, the gentleman, I'm not going to say his name, but I'm thinking about him, and he's a master sergeant, right, is unwilling to take an experimental emergency use authorized vaccine in his body, the value he has to the Marine Corps at that point goes to absolutely zero.
Wow, I didn't think about it that way. So when they wanted these highly trained, backed by millions of dollars of support to create this unit, I'm very interested in how you're describing this, because we don't think about it that way. We just assume you guys are so well trained, but we don't think about everything that goes into it. And we also sort of have this expectation as citizens that, people in units like this are, at your peak physical, peak mental capability to keep us safe. And
Right.
you're so right. You're being basically forced to take an experimental vaccine, or at least a brand new vaccine that has not had the ability to go through enough clinical trials, not enough time has gone by. And you're noticing some of these after effects they're popping up here and there, some health issues that are not looking good. And it sounds like it's going against everything that you have been trained to do in order to protect those underneath you, protect this unit, and make sure that it is operating at that high level. And you said no. What happened when you expressed your concerns or refused to take that vaccine? And also, did it affect not just you? Did it affect those who were working underneath you at that time?
Yeah. So, Kyle, you mentioned my duty, right? I mean, the recon community, we're the eyes and ears of the Marine commanders. And I took my job serious. And that's why I did so much research on this. And I tried desperately to warn them that there was a lot of dimensions, right? I'm not a health professional, but I put together hours and hours and hours worth of information from, Dr. Peter McCullough, for example, Dr. Robert Malone. In the early days of this, these are people who had incredible credentials, and they are sounding the alarm. And what I was told, Kyle, that I did have one colonel above me who I knew he cared about me enough to just tell me, Tommy, you need to understand that this is political, and you better tread very carefully because you're going to be crushed like an ant. That's what he told me, right? And so when you think back on it, there's a lot of dimensions to this. In fact, as I reflected on it later, it's pretty amazing. The people at the very, very top of the institutions, the federal government under this administration, what they were able to achieve. They told us in the beginning, don't worry, there's going to be a process for religious accommodations. All you have to do is tell us your strongly held religious beliefs, right? The entire U.S. federal government, that entire enterprise, extracted the strongly held religious beliefs for its employees, for those of us that wanted to share that information. Imagine how incredible that is in terms of data harvesting, if in fact it's your agenda to not have people of faith in uniform. Once they got that data, then they began the extremely brutal process of purging the force of anyone who would not comply. And, there's a book written, in fact, I have a copy, I'll just grab it and show it to you. It's written by an active duty Navy commander. It's called Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines. And Rob Green, in that book, describes how exactly this mandate was a complete violation of the oath of office to the U.S. Constitution, but also the law. And I'd be happy to talk about that too, if you're interested.
Well, I just want to make sure that I'm hearing you right, because this is really surprising. It sounds like they asked you, or they promised that if anyone was going to express a religious objection to the COVID-19 vaccine, that you would not have to take it. So those who were men and women of faith raised their hands. Hey, I'm Catholic. I would like a religious exemption. I'm Christian. This goes against what I believe in my faith life. And they took that data and then said, great, now we know who we don't want here. And we're going to go and systematically just kind of like put the pressure on so much, or excuse you from service. I know that's not the terminology that they use, but is that what happened? I mean, did they literally just figure out who they needed to target and then they targeted you?
I believe so. Yeah, Kyle. I mean, and it was specifically designed to test the officers, right? So the oath of office for the officer corps and for the enlisted is slightly different. And we, as officers, take an oath to the U.S. Constitution. And in the enlisted oath, you actually say that you will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders the officers appointed over me. That's not in the officer oath. And so what I believe part of this was also to do was to identify officers who would have an allegiance to the U.S. Constitution over and above any type of political allegiance. And another part of it was to identify officers that would break the law for them, right? So when it comes to vaccines or any medical treatment for the military can be compelled under the law to take a vaccine if it's FDA approved, okay? That's the law. And at the time that this mandate was in place, the only vaccines that were available were emergency use authorized, or EUA vaccines, right? And in August 2021, the FDA approved the Pfizer Comirnaty version of the vaccine, which had not been manufactured. Within hours, the Department of Defense put out this notice that because of this FDA approval, they will now mandate it. As a commander, I could not get an FDA authorized vaccine, which meant that I'd have to do something that would violate the law. And that is, I would have to compel my subordinates against their will to take it. Kyle, there's something called informed consent. The law says that if there's an emergency use authorized product, it's experimental, that the person being experimented on has what's called informed consent. You have to be informed of the risks and you have to give your consent. And so if the President of the United States, President Biden, has the authority from Congress in the law to waive the informed consent requirement, and he did not. And so what they did was a very, very, I think, very intelligent methodology of testing the officer corps. Will they research the law well enough to know what they are permitted and not permitted to do? And will they break the law for us? And the ones that would not break the law for them, they brutally punished. I was blessed, Kyle, in that my change of command had already been scheduled. So I was already on the way out. So the Marine Corps waited just a few hours after I passed the guide on to the next commander to publish the guidance that at that point, any unvaccinated officer in command would be immediately relieved for cause. So it could have been a lot worse for me, but it wasn't. But the Marine Corps was absolutely brutal to the young Marines that they persecuted. And I don't know how much you want to go into it, but I would be happy to describe the levels of persecution that took place if you think the audience would be interested.
Well, I think it's so interesting, and I'm glad that you took your time and did this research. Plus, you had the benefit of just kind of this higher level of access to intelligence and information that, obviously a lot of us don't have. So you were working with more than a full deck's worth of information here against this. And it's concerning. It's not making me feel great about the military and what they did during that time. But let me ask you this. So very recently, Anthony Fauci, who you just mentioned, has been testifying on what happened with the creation of the vaccine and also the creation and implementation of all of the protocols around lockdowns and these things like keeping 6 feet away from each other, masking children, things that had very negative effects on kids particularly, but resulted in a lot of health issues and certainly in a lot of deaths of American citizens. And what we're hearing from him now is that the information that he was working with wasn't exactly solid. And he's coming out saying, you know what, I didn't really have a basis here. I didn't really have like a scientific basis for making these decisions. And what we are hearing from him now is that he was kind of flying blind on this, or he had information he wasn't sharing with the administration at the time, creating these protocols and then doling them out, mandating them or asking for them to be mandated. And then we all suffered the consequences. What happened with the military, with the armed forces during that progression? And is anything happening now that we're hearing from Dr. Fauci that maybe this was a lot of smoke being blown after all?
Kyle, what separates Fauci and many of the people who operated to facilitate the demands that he placed on this country and its health protocol, they are completely different than the nature of our nonprofit. Remember what I told you about the mission statement. We provide uncompromised analysis. Mr. Fauci and many of the decision makers in our government, in elected office, are not uncompromised. The amount of money that flows from the pharmaceutical industry, in some cases from foreign governments, from many different areas, can compromise people. And so I think that there ought to be a very thorough investigation to figure out just how compromised the people are that made these sorts of decisions. So I don't buy Anthony Fauci's argument that he was just flying blind. He wasn't blind. He knew exactly what happened. He knew that he had funded the gain of function research at that laboratory. He was responsible for it. Okay. He knew exactly what he was doing. And it's my belief that he's incredibly compromised, as are many, many, many of our elected officials and members of the U.S. government in the uniform and out of the uniform of the U.S. military.
Do you think that should we have a change in presidential administration coming up here this fall, that those investigations will happen? COVID came to us during the end of the Trump presidency. And so a lot of this, creation of the vaccine, Operation Warp Speed, happened under Donald Trump. Should he be elected again, do you think that the level of investigation over this that needs to happen is going to happen?
It's hard to say. I mean, I pray that it will, Kyle. I mean, I hope that Mr. Trump can understand the ways in which I believe he was misled by very powerful players in the pharmaceutical industry, very powerful players in the regulatory environment, such as the FDA. I mean, look, there were very promising treatments for COVID that I witnessed during the onset of the pandemic be strangled by the FDA, and very, very what turned out to be harmful medical protocols and treatments that were promoted by the FDA and people like Fauci that killed people, many, many people. And so I think, Kyle, what's needed is a Nuremberg trial 2.0. I don't think that there's been so much damage done experimentally to the human population since the original Nuremberg trials that held accountable people in Nazi Germany. It was worse with COVID, with the development of the virus, the suppression of truth about the development and funding of that gain of function research, and the layout of the vaccine, the mandates of it. It's catastrophic. And so I think I pray that there will be justice and accountability. So far, the only accountability that I've seen is to hold accountable anyone who won't violate that program. And again, Kyle, it's brutal. The Marine Corps, especially the Marine Corps, was exceptionally enthusiastic about the methods by which it inflicted moral injury and economic injury in its young service members. Blanket denials of the religious accommodations on the Marine Corps birthday, November 10th, 2021. That's meant to inflict a moral injury. And then they chose the ability to use the separation code, commission of a serious offense, as the code for which they would separate these young Marines, which allowed them to strip the honorable characterization of service and allow them to make sure that those Marines would not have access to the kinds of benefits, educational or health benefits, that they may otherwise have. So the leaders of the Marine Corps did everything they could, some of them at the very top, to harm anyone who would not comply.
So the COVID vaccine mandate really ended up removing a lot of service members. Where does the military stand today in your estimation? You know better than almost anyone. We've heard stories about recruitment being down, difficulties in recruiting for the military. What's the status of the United States military right now today?
Well, Kyle, obviously my perspective is going to be somewhat dated because I have not worn the uniform in over 2 years. I'm also admittedly a reservist for the last 10 years of my career, right? So you're not talking about a guy who lived 24/7 in an active duty capacity. And so do I have my finger on the pulse of what's happening right now across the U.S. military? Not so much, but it doesn't take a rocket ship scientist to see the terrible, terrible numbers we have with respect to recruiting. It doesn't take a scientist to see the abysmal record of the General Officer Corps of the United States military today in winning wars. I mean, look, think about it. Afghanistan, right? Just look at the year 2021. The first thing you had was this, quote, extremism in the ranks stand down. Hundreds of hours were spent supposedly to root out extremists in the ranks. You know, the material that we were given, Kyle, it deliberately omitted 6 examples of extremists, if you want to call them that, in the ranks. Jihadis, people who killed or planned to kill their fellow service members for the sake of Islamic jihad, right? Major Nidal Hassan at Fort Hood. None of those examples were part of that extremism standout. Yet not one general officer anywhere noted that. In fact, they prohibit us from learning the truth about jihad and Sharia. That is outlawed in the U.S. military. And so what does that produce? Look through the year 2021, the most important thing in August and September of 2021 was the vaccine mandate. Where are you at with this mandate? What happened in August, September 2021? The collapse of Afghanistan. And you got to ask yourself, as people watched, I mean, you could see it on Twitter, videos, the flatbed trucks pouring across the Pakistani border to Bagram to cart off all of our military equipment and the billions and tens of billions of dollars of our equipment. Was there a single general officer anywhere in the United States military that said a single word and said, wait, this is not a good idea to leave Bagram first? Wait, we shouldn't be letting the Taliban take all this stuff. Not a single one. Our government handed the Taliban lists of American citizens in Afghanistan.
Oh my God, I'm like almost speechless. I mean, we knew it was bad. We knew it was bad, but I don't think that the American people really truly understood, number one, how bad it was, and number two, why. Why, if we had been here for so long trying to help these people and understanding the dynamics there, that the exit would be as disastrous as it was. Do you think that a change in presidential leadership is going to have the necessary effect on the U.S. military that it sounds like is very much needed?
Well, Kyle, it all just depends. It depends on what the president is willing to do. It depends on how many people he's willing to fire, ultimately. because you're not going to fix this without accountability. You're not going to fix this without incredibly aggressive investigations and holding people accountable for what was done. There needs to be a massive, massive undertaking to root out the rot that is at the very top.
Yeah, Donald Trump has mentioned previously that he would do things similar to that, right? Clean outs of government agencies. And so, time will tell, and that's only should he be reelected. I want to ask you too, we have so many things I want to cover, but we don't have all the time today. I guess I just want to ask you generally your thoughts on, is America safe today with the military as it stands? Are we safe right now? We've got a lot of international conflict going on. China circling, this axis of evil, China, Iran, Russia. They seem very poised and almost just waiting to see what's going to happen at the end of this year. Do you feel confident in the way that the U.S. military is set up now to protect us at home?
I'll let your listeners consider this point as an answer to that question. Just in the past week, the 4-star general that is in charge of the National Guard Bureau, when asked about sending our military personnel to the border, complained that doing such a thing was a wrongful use of the U.S. military. Now, granted, I understand he said, well, that's because they should be training, readiness to be ready to fight foreign wars. We have an invasion taking place in this country right now. And we're talking about numbers. I mean, on a monthly basis, more than the entire strength of the United States Marine Corps comes through our southern border, just the southern border, right? The entire Marine Corps is less than 200,000 Marines. You have usually more than that entering this country every single month. And yet, at the very top of the U.S. military, the general officers seem to see no problem with allowing that to continue to happen. Reflect on that for a moment about how safe we are. The tens of thousands of military-aged Chinese males pouring into this country. The fact that China in 2015 took from the Office of Personnel and Management the data on all of us who had security clearances. So the Chinese Communist Party knows everything about me, my family, where they live, all of that. And now they have tens of thousands of military-aged males in this country. And I haven't seen a single person in uniform with stars on their rank, on their collar, take one step publicly to talk about that being a problem. I'm not saying that they're not doing anything about it. There's still good people in uniform. I know some of them. I'm not going to say their names. But publicly, I don't see any evidence of it. So we are absolutely not safe right now.
Right. We're not hearing about that at all. But do you think that we are at this point in time, is our military outnumbered by foreign nationals on our own soil right now?
Potentially. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, right? I mean, we don't even know how many have come into this country, but it's in the millions and millions, right? The end strength of the active duty end strength is roughly 1.4 million service members, right? So if you were to add up all, I mean, even if you added up all the reserves, the National Guard, active duty forces, I mean, you're talking about probably only 1/5 of the numbers of people that entered this country in the last 3 years, right? And I'm not saying they're all military-age males and they're all bad guys, but that's some significant numbers. But, Kyle, here's the other thing. And this is something, you mentioned it in my bio. I work for the U.S. Air Force Electromagnetic Defense Task Force. There was, thankfully, for a short period of time, a task force that was looking at the threats like nuclear EMP, like what would happen if we lost the electric grid. The fact that all of our military bases, at least 90% plus, depend on the civilian electric grid, right? And the people in charge of the military today, the 3-star general that started the Electromagnetic Defense Task Force, courageous Lieutenant General Stephen Quast, I mean, he was forced to retire under President Trump, right? And so that task force, the amazing work of that task force, we have very little to show for it because the people in uniform have not been serious about protecting the homeland. If we lose electricity, those service members on those bases are going to starve to death the same way the rest of us will if we can't get the electricity to come back up. And it's something I desperately tried while I was in uniform to get them to wake up to. So we need a cleaning of house, and then we need people who are serious about the homeland, not just what's out there around the rest of the world, but where we live right here.
China is a nation that's been very open about their desire to take total control of the electric grid for the planet. Do you think that we are underestimating, even with how transparent they have been and how open they have spoken about their intentions for control? Are we underestimating their capabilities and their plans, do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, underestimating would be charitable, honestly. Let's go back again to the uncompromised analysis that we provide, right? Who's paying who? Where does the money come from? Make these kinds of decisions. I mean, to President Trump's credit, when he was in office, there was a discovery of a Chinese manufactured transformer that had a hardware backdoor, like a way that someone remotely could shut that thing off. That's a huge problem. And so he passed an executive order on May 1st, 2020, that would help to try to address that threat of these components coming from China and other adversary nations. In the first 10 hours of the Biden administration, Biden suspended that executive order. At the time, there were about 300 Chinese transformers in the U.S. grid. Our latest estimates are 449. And to my knowledge, the only people tracking them are a nonprofit like us.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for what Center for Security Policy is doing. It sounds like the work that you do is the work that the NSA should be doing. The NSA should be doing this, but I'm not even going to try to explain what I think they're over there doing. I think they have their own goals currently. And of course, they're going to have their own goals under any particular presidential administration. But the Center for Security Policy has really picked up that mantle of keeping America safe and keeping an eye on foreign enemies. And we're grateful to you for it. We're so thankful that you guys are doing that work and sharing what you are finding with the administration and with the American people. I've got time for one last question for you, Lieutenant Colonel, and it's going to be a more personal one because you are just such a tremendous patriot. You have served this nation courageously, valiantly for so many years, and it's very obvious when anyone speaks to you that you care very deeply about America and American people. What does the future hold for you? Are you ever at any point going to consider a potential run for political office?
Well, Kyle, I mean, the future for me is just whatever I feel like God's calling me to do, right? And I wish I could tell you what that is. I just ask for the next 24 hours. I just ask him to light the path for the next 24 hours to help me make the next right decision. Because and I don't want your listeners to live in fear and anxiety, right? A lot of stuff we talked about, it's scary. And honestly, it should make them angry, but we have to recognize that, St. Augustine said that hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to make sure that they don't remain that way. And so all I plan on doing, Kyle, is continuing to ask my Creator to show me what path to walk, to use the truth as best I can to wake people up physically, spiritually, and then to just try to muster every day the courage to do what is right, to make sure that these wrongs don't remain that way. If that's political office, I guess it's not something I want to do. I'd have to say that God would have to make it really, really obvious for me. Because right now, what's obvious is that this country needs a nonprofit doing what we do. I didn't mention before, Kyle, that we don't take a dime from the government at any level. We don't take a dime from any foreign source or from any company that could profit off of what we recommend. It is purely for the public interest. And the nation needs a group of people who are willing to do that uncompromised analysis, unflinching leadership, and unconventional solutions to keep them safer. So as long as I feel like God's calling me to do that, that's what the future holds for me.
Well, thank you for answering that. It's so admirable. And again, very thankful to everyone at Center for Security Policy for the great and very needed work that you all are doing there. I'll convince you offline to run for some political office. But thank you again, Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Waller, just for your generous time today and for sharing what you did. It's such an important story for people to hear and understand about, and your insight is very greatly appreciated. So thank you so much for being with me today.
Absolutely. Cal, thanks for having me on.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of Politically Basic, where we break down the basics of all political issues and let you decide. Be sure to follow us at politicallybasic.com and at politicallybasic on all socials so you don't miss a single episode. See you next time.